Hi, I'm Gary White for Central Kentucky Television. I'm here with two authors, one of which we've had on here a few times before, Dixie Hibbs and Doris Settles, and they have co-written a book called Prohibition in Bardstown, Bourbon, Bootlegging, and Saloons. Wow, that's exciting. Now, you were saying that's kind of an oxymoron.
Well, it is kind of an oxymoron, Prohibition in Bardstown. You know, we've been making whiskey here since the 1780s. Most of it legal, but there was some illegal. By the time we got to after the Civil War, people were making their own version and selling it without paying the tax. And of course, they went to jail for it. I like to call it jugs to jail. You know, if you're making it in jugs and selling it, you're going to go to jail.
Well, let's say some of them went to jail.
Yeah.
That's right. Some of them
If you get caught.
If you got caught. But when Prohibition came along, this was the notice of death almost to all of the distilling industry in Nelson County. When I say that, they could not make it, they could not sell it, and they couldn't pay the taxes on it because they couldn't sell it. So they had these warehouses full of whiskey, which was great temptation for all the thieves in this part of the country. Mm-hmm. And thieves that were next door, and thieves that came out of Chicago, and thieves that came out of Louisville, and our tourist industry really picked up during that time. They were coming for the spirits here, but the stories that are in this book all have to do with what went on between 1920 and 1933. But we have to lay a groundwork behind it, which is what Doris did so much of it for me. We kind of split the book up. Doris is a very learned writer and historian, but the thing I love most about it, we kind of are on the same beam. Mm-hmm. You know, she'll say something I understand, I say something she understands, and that doesn't always work with historians. You got to be on the same kind of.
And it doesn't always work with writers.
Yeah, that's true.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think we really enjoyed working together because we bounced ideas off each other and we bounced stories off each other, and I'm a good researcher, and so I love spending time just delving into, as Dixie is, but I really love delving into information and gathering stories, and to me that's what history is. It's his story.
Right.
And so I would do that and come up with something new, and then I got to read all of the oral histories that Dixie had done years ago when she did Prohibition oral histories. With people that are no longer with us. So we have their words, and their words are in the book, and their stories are in the book.
So why don't we talk a little about how this project came about, because we know Dixie's here in Bardstown. Are you from Bardstown? You're from Lexington, is that correct?
Well, my family's from Bardstown.
Okay, so you have a Bardstown connection as well. Okay.
My grandfather was a dentist here, and he had 3 sons and 1 daughter, who was my mother, and his 3 sons are dentists. So 2 of them practiced in Bardstown, John Oakley and Bill Oakley. Okay. And the other one went northwest. He's up there. And my father was from here as well. He lived or grew up out on Ben Irvin Road. Okay. And so my grandmother lived on North 3rd Street, and I spent every single summer of my childhood here, and every Christmas and every Derby. So I remember sitting on my grandparents' porch and stringing beans or shelling peas or peeling peaches or whatever, with my grandfather over in his Panama hat and his huge cigar, and whoever was dropping by sitting with us, and in the summer steam and mash surrounding all of us.
Yes, familiar with the
So
odor
I was
and
very
the
familiar with why Bardstown really is the bourbon capital of the world.
Okay, great. So you both have a strong history for Bardstown as well. Yeah. Now, he said that it's Prohibition in Bardstown, but actually it's going all around the country pretty much, because Prohibition, Bardstown reaches out to so many different places, right?
Right.
But not only that, we really began with how distilling began in ancient Egypt and ancient Greece, and then we take it through the places in the world that really picked it up and did a lot of, and created the original whiskeys. And then they came over to the United States, and the Whiskey Rebellion happened, and so the distillers in Pennsylvania moved to Kentucky to avoid paying those taxes, and they found limestone water, wonderful fields,
and cold, when they're growing corn. the big
Exactly.
bills and more. Mm-hmm.
And then the market with the livestock to get rid of the, what is it called?
Slop.
Slop, thank you.
That stuff.
Yeah, that's
So that's how this area really became the well, and created the only truly American distillate.
Okay. So we were creating the bourbon here in Kentucky for 150, whatever it was at that time.
well, 200 years.
200 years at that
70,
point.
80, yeah.
And then in 1920s, they said we couldn't do it anymore, right?
Well, the ones who, I can't think of the word now, wonderful word here, the ladies who were marching against it, what were they called?
People who didn't want you to drink.
Temperance union.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You see, it's been about 6 months since we wrote this. The temperance people, and they were fighting against the idea of alcohol of any kinds because they thought this was the spirit of the devil, and people were husbands were not paying for their children's food, and they were all being tempted into going into saloons and wasting all their money there and coming out drunk and beating their families. And it wasn't the husbands and it wasn't the saloons, it was the whiskey. So we're against whiskey. And one of the things, I'm going to diverse here, man, you've been around me enough, we meander really bad. We just, historians.
And we tend to talk over each other.
Yeah. I think it was 1820 was the earliest time I found a reference to a temperance or people who wanted to make a pact not to drink any spirituous beverages, they call them, any spirituous beverages.
So this didn't start in the early 1900s.
No.
The movement, really nationally, but certainly here as well, against alcoholic beverages of any kind. But more for the higher proof things.
Right.
Actually, some places were able to sell lower proof, like beers and ales,
things,
correct, even during Prohibition. But there really was a fairly strong movement that of course gained momentum over the 100 years that it took, that we can document, or do document in the book, that it took place.
About a year ago, I discovered a record-keeping book, or like the minutes, of a Templar, T-E-M-P-L-A-R, association in Bardstown. And in all the years I've researched, I'd never seen this and never noted any reference to the Templars. Finally, I realized I'd been seeing advertisements about them, not realizing it was a temperance society, a place that people made a vow or a promise or a commitment not to drink spirituous beverages, men and women.
Huh.
And this particular society went on from 1868 to 1878 as far as the book was. Now, I'm not sure when it quit, but I thought that was pretty significant. You've got all these different townspeople that I recognize their names, and then you had them falling off the wagon and coming back in and pleading to be let back in, just like today would happen. And it was not a social group because it was more of a movement. They wanted to show people that you could do this, that you didn't have to drink to be part of society and things. And it was real funny people would tell on each other. The member would say, "I saw so and so, and he was at this wedding and he was imbibing," and try spelling imbibing sometimes when you're trying to.
When you have been.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Those were the temperance movements here locally, and I was very surprised we had any because of the economic benefit alcohol has. But everybody disagrees with something, so this one that. But the big thing on our industry and what comes out in this book too is talking about after the Civil War, we had a great industry before, but it was small and family owned. After the Civil War, it starts really growing. Along the railroads, we talked about the book I did on the distilleries before Prohibition a couple of years ago. And those had grown up from earlier starts to being big operations by the time 1890 came along. And here we are 20 years later, 30 years later, from 1890, and they're saying, nope, can't do this anymore. Just you're out of business.
And I think, to me, one of the most interesting things about the research we did were the unintended consequences for Nelson County. And some of them turned out wonderfully for the area, some of them not so much. And one of them is I'm sure if they really put any thought into it at all, they would realize the economic devastation that would happen, particularly for this area. Nelson County and Bardstown and surrounding areas, really all of central Kentucky, but most primarily Nelson County, saw the Depression 10 years before the rest of the country did because of Prohibition.
Yeah.
And the economic impact was so devastating that they had to start coming up with other ideas on how to earn money. And one of those ways, and we talk about why this happened too, why Bardstown was kind of ideally situated to become a hotbed for tourism. And so that whole ball started rolling faster and faster when that was kind of the only economic option that they had when distilling was that and illegally getting rid of the goods that were in the warehouses or moonshine or whatever.
So did moonshine exist prior to
Yes.
Prohibition?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Always. In fact, probably from Scotland.
Into Scotland and
Scotland,
Ireland,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But it became a very, just like in the 70s, I remember law enforcement saying that marijuana was the biggest cash crop in Kentucky. The state didn't get any benefit from it, and that's changed. But the same was true during Prohibition for moonshine. Even still, I think, when you're out driving in the evening down the Bluegrass Parkway, or particularly in the eastern and far western parts of the state, you see a hillside covered with forest, and you'll see a little plume of smoke going up, and I always wonder if that's a moonshine still.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's exactly how most of them were found by the revenuers. But the relationship between the revenuers and the moonshiners is just fascinating. Many of them were good friends. They played on a very
Baseball.
well-known and
Baseball teams and-
and a baseball team that was extremely successful throughout the state. And you had the revenuer and the moonshiner playing on the same team, good friends with each other, going to each other's kids' weddings and that sort of thing, having dinner together. And that's something that most people just really don't think about. And then you have them getting shot. So the moonshiners shooting the revenuers or vice versa.
Wow. So how long was Prohibition in effect?
The prohibition from the amendment was 1920 to 1933. Repeal took place in December of 1933. But we had what we call time prohibition. First World War, the Great War, as they said, it was put in place during that time. And when that happened, that really gave our local distillers and all the industries connected with distilling an idea of what it was going to be like if it actually came through with passing the amendment. Some of them went on. Actually, I don't think many of them were even producing after the war because they had warehouses full of whiskey. They didn't have to make any more. They had to figure out how to get rid of it. And that's really one of the biggest problems around here was we had too much in the warehouses. And people, when you made whiskey, then often you made it under contract where people said, I want 20 barrels, I want 100 barrels or whatever. And that was their whiskey. And you were storing it and you were paying, the owner was paying the storage cost, including the taxes.
Because remember, bourbon doesn't just get made in a day.
Right.
It takes years.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that was part of the problem after Prohibition, and then after World War II, when they shut down many distilleries to make industrial alcohols for the war effort. And so then when they were given the go-ahead to start manufacturing bourbon again, we had a 4-year gap before they could fill a single order.
Because it has to age.
That way. But those distilleries were real handy. Then industrial alcohol helped in the war effort, but they would let them distill 1 month out of the year, and they had that let them put some product in the warehouses, but nothing like what they were used to doing. And then they were upset that the slop that was coming from the industrial production of alcohol, they were using rye and wheat, and the farmers were afraid it was going to make their animals sick, and they wouldn't take the slop. Well, you got to take the slop. It's got to go somewhere. You know how much if you've ever been to a distillery and you see how much comes off. And the government finally guaranteed them, if your animal gets sick, we'll pay for it. I mean, because they had to they couldn't put it in the river or the lake or something. That's pollution. And they literally gave it away, but even then, nobody wanted it. So they finally came to agreement that if your animal gets sick or dies, we will replace it. We'll pay for it.
Wow.
Yeah. There's a lot of twists and turns in all of these stories. One of the we did a lot of research online, but we did most of my research I did at the library. I went and read the local papers. I read the Kentucky Standard, and 1920 it says the dreaded day is here. You know, no more alcohol sales, no more production. But then we have it on microfilm, and you can sit there each week and read about what happens. And I'm making notes and copying it. And every week there's strangers in town who've come through and been stopped, and they've had whiskey in their car. Sometimes in bottles, sometimes in jugs. Sometimes it's red, and sometimes it's white. And what would you think the white would be?
That's moonshine, isn't it?
That's right. And they call it red goods and white goods. The red goods was the whiskey that they'd taken from the warehouses. And some of it was in bottles. Now, for some reason, up until last year, I didn't realize it was in bottles. But if they say it's bonded whiskey, that means it's already been put in a bottle with the seal on it. So that made more sense to me than trying to drain all those barrels, which they did a lot of that too. They put it in milk cans. They would load buckets of it, put it in a wheelbarrow and trot it off somewhere. All of these ingenious people. When you're a thief, you can come up with lots of ideas on how to steal things. But it is interesting to read the sheriff, the local law, and the federal law. The revenuers, as they call them. They had no respect for each other. What was happening, the federal lawmakers were taking bribes not to turn their head, not to see what was going on. And some of them took the bribe and still arrested you, which didn't make people very happy. And then with this corruptness going on, the local lawmakers, law enforcers, were having a hard time deciding who to believe, so to speak. You had to really wide open catch the car with the goods on it, and sometimes the revenuers would pour it out in the ditch or in front of. Actually, there was a car stopped in front of Spalding Hall on 5th Street, and they poured all the alcohol out in the curb in the ditch there and set it on fire. And I think it's real ironic today. That's where we have our bourbon festival. Yeah. It's right there in the lawn in front of Spalding Hall. But it's a lot of history in here that sets the stage. That's what, when we talked about doing this, I said, we've got to tell people why we're the bourbon capital. So we started that part and came forward. And then also the temperance movements and the old distilleries that are here in 96 and then what happened to them. And then, like you say, the consequences and the unintended consequences. Right. The tourism, we had people traveling through here, but Mile Kentucky Home was opened in 23. The St. Joseph Cathedral had just celebrated its 100th anniversary in 19. And then we had the Abbey of Gethsemane, we had Nazareth, the John Fitch Monument got unveiled in 1927. So we're doing things to encourage people to come to Bardstown. And
then in the 50s, the drama started, and things just really built on each other. And I think Bardstown did, and Nelson County did an excellent job of really fine-tuning those things that really made it one of the top tourist destinations. And it didn't hurt that nationally, the whole country was feeling better about the economy, better about their ability to buy a car and travel. And so road trips really became big in the 50s. And we talk in the book too about why all roads led to Bardstown from the early 1800s because of its predominance as a political center. There's one story about Ben Hardin when he had first started his law career. He was in Elizabethtown, and he went down to the jail to try and get clients early on. And one client in the jail said, well, what do you charge? And he said $300 and to do whatever it was to represent him, I guess. And the client said, well, for that I can get a Bardstown lawyer. And Ben Hardin thought, I think I'll become a Bardstown lawyer. Yep. So he did.
He did. Moved to Bardstown.
So it had that kind of reputation, that they had the best lawyers. They had, and if you look at the political influence that Bardstown had from its founding up through the Civil War.
Well, yes,
and beyond.
And then Ben Johnson became a very strong political figure. He was congressman from 1900 to 5, I think it is. Don't hold me on 5. But anyway, he became the highway commissioner for the state of Kentucky. Now this is where we are here in Prohibition. Here comes Depression. I mean, and being highway commissioner, he had charge over lots of construction things and lots of jobs. And everyone that needed a job would go hat in hand to Ben Johnson. He'd try to find him one. So he did more for Nelson County when he was highway commissioner than he was able to do as congressman.
So why was Prohibition rescinded? Did it have anything to do with the Depression?
No.
Not really.
It had to do with people being angry. It was costing the federal government millions and millions of dollars to enforce it. And they weren't enforcing it.
Or marginally enforce it.
Yeah, whatever. The other thing, the feeling in the country, it was the individuals, our voters, our people who said, this isn't working, we're going to get rid of it. And they worked very hard, and the ratification was in December. They probably passed it. Do you know when they passed
Repeal day was in December 5th or 7th, one or the other.
I'm trying to think when the amendment was first passed. It has to be like 6 or 7 months before.
I think it was January.
Okay. It takes, because all these states have to ratify it. You have to have a majority of states.
I think the final ratification was in January.
Okay. Anyway, the whole thing about that was, and Roosevelt knew it. I mean, all of the big politicians knew this had to go through it. And that was one of the promises that he made when he ran.
And the book explains that even though the anti-alcohol or temperance movement began in the early 1800s, almost as soon as people were making it,
right.
Or we had a country for people to make it in, and a government to address issues, it didn't really gain momentum until the early 1900s when a national lobbying group was formed. So the individuals, the Carrie Nations, who actually is a Kentuckian, interestingly, there's so many little ironies that run throughout all of this, that's why I think we had so much fun dealing with it.
Yeah.
And all this is in this book, right?
It is.
Well, it's Prohibition in Bardstown. It's bourbon, bootlegging, and saloons. And again, we have Dixie and we have Doris, who are the authors here.
We want to invite you. We want
Yes.
to invite everybody, because we're going to have a launching. I love the idea of a launching a rocket here. We're going to
We hope.
We have this book at the Oscar Getz Museum of Whiskey History, which is in Spalding Hall. And Spalding Hall is right behind the cathedral in Bardstown. On the 14th of May, between 1 and 5, we will be there signing books, and we're going to make a little treat. There's about 6 or 8 recipes in the back of this book, and we're going to make a treat from one of the recipes for people to try.
Okay.
You can talk to both of us. We'll both be available to sign. It sells for $22 and make a great Father's Day gift. Or Mother's Day gift. You know, we got to watch that when we say those things. a late Mother's Day gift.
Post Mother's Day gift.
Yeah.
Because you've done the women of bourbon.
No, I didn't do that. Another one did that.
Okay,
Yeah.
but we've had that too. So we
Yeah.
know there are a lot of women that are involved, right?
Involved.
But all the recipes are Kentucky recipes with bourbon. One of them 100 years old, from a 100-year-old cookbook.
1913.
Oh, wow.
We had a 1913.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Bardstown Women's Club put out a 1913 cookbook in honor or support of the girls of Bardstown High School. Ladies, they call them girls. Anyway, recipes in there were all the prominent women in Bardstown and teachers. They gave the recipes. And we're looking through there to see if we can use one. And there's several that have whiskey, but not everything. But then I found a fruitcake recipe. Oh my, it had a half a pint of whiskey in it. It was, I guess you use it at Christmas.
For those high school ladies.
Yeah.
People liked fruitcake at that time.
Those are
For a
good
very
reasons.
different reason.
Right.
So have you tried some of the recipes?
I haven't.
I have tried. I've made the bread pudding recipe, and I haven't made the bourbon ball
Yeah, we're gonna
recipe,
make
but I
bourbon
know
balls.
somebody that has.
Yeah.
Actually, I think the bourbon ball recipe came out of a women's club book from Bardstown that was my grandmother Oakley's that I have inherited. My mother got it, and now I have it. And I think that's where, and she used to make bourbon balls. Of course, that's the only reason she ever bought bourbon.
Exactly. Yes.
As a good Baptist.
Yes.
That's right.
So the launch is going to be on the 14th, correct?
And it's
1 to 5?
Yes. Well, also in the museum, if you haven't had a chance to see the Oscar Getz Museum of Whiskey History, this is a great opportunity to come in and look around, enjoy that, and look at the book, ask questions. And if you're worried about your ancestors being in there, There's a possibility.
Certainly.
If you made the paper, you probably made the book. Because, you know, when you're in the newspaper, that's public information. But in most of it, really, people know, and the oral history we talked about there, 13 people were interviewed, and I think all but 2 of them are dead. And it was really interesting to hear them again talk about their memories of theirs and their family members. But again, it's great to have another book.
If somebody
And I use several books from my mother-in-law, who turns 98 this summer, and actually was a bottling girl at Fairfield Distillery before she married. So right after Prohibition. Right after Prohibition. She was born in 1918, so she, as a child, doesn't remember much about Prohibition, except I think the impact and how poor people were. Yeah. But I don't know that she really connected
that was
Prohibition
why.
with that was why.
That's why.
But she had quite a few 50, 80, and 100-year-old books that I was able to look through and get information from. And
that's great.
And so that was fun.
So you can get this at the launch, but if they can't get there for that, how else can somebody get a copy of this book?
Well, there'll be several other events here in Bardstown and Louisville and Lexington. On June 14th, which is National Bourbon Day, we'll be at the Bourbon Bistro, or Bourbon and Bistro in Louisville.
We're going to be at the public library on...
I don't remember the date.
It's a Saturday. I believe it's before that. I think it's the 11th or something.
And we're setting up 2 other events in Bardstown, one at the Mary May house.
And that's on...
that I'm not sure we've set a date for that yet. And then one at the...
I don't know which bed and breakfast you're talking about.
No, the other one's
Around
Kentucky Bourbon something.
Marketplace.
Yes,
Marketplace.
yes, the Kentucky Bourbon
That's the
Marketplace.
That's the Mary May house. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they own both of them. But so you can contact Kentucky Bourbon Marketplace too to find out the dates and all the information on that.
And they should have copies. The Oscar Getz
well.
Museum should have copies after the launch.
Yeah.
So there'll be several places here in town.
Yeah, the 2 drugstores, the Hearst drugstore and the Croom drugstore have copies.
Okay.
And the Artist Barrel, where I have booths. I have quilts and books at Artist Barrel, which is on North 3rd Street.
So lots of places in downtown Bardstown. You get a copy of this new book. And, you know, the book has these 2 ladies as the author, and I know one of them, at least, is in the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame because we have her still here, Dixie, right? Are you in the Hall of Fame too?
I am not.
Okay. We're going to get you a still next time, right? But this is Dixie still for that.
Well, I thought people, when we start talking about stills and moonshine making, you know, you have to have an image in your mind, and it's pretty much out in the woods and barrels, buckets and everything else, and I happened to have, this was what I was given when I was put in the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame, and so I thought, there's a nice image we can use.
And I actually inherited a copper still, a modified copper still. I can't tell you where it came from. Maybe nobody wanted to tell me where it came from, but my son actually has that at his house now, but it's like that big and this round, and somebody took the top and made it an on-off top, so it's usable as like a
He can make his own moonshine.
He
Don't
might.
tell us where he is.
He might.
Stop anybody coming out there. But again, the book is Prohibition in Bardstown. We have Dixie Hibbs and Doris Settles, who are the authors of this book. And they're going to have several events all throughout downtown Bardstown coming up over the next several months. On May the 14th, definitely at the Oscar Getz Museum, or else you can go to several stores and pick it up. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Or contact one of us.
Absolutely, that's right. Let us know and we'll get you in touch. This has been Gary White for Central Kentucky Television.
Thank you.